Loading up, loading up. Okay. I think that's everything in place. We've given it enough time for people to log in who are coming from other sources. And I need to tell YouTube that this video is not fit for children. Otherwise, it won't let comments happen. And then back there, and boom, now comments are allowed. Wish they had a different way of having that button, but you know, user interface. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good evening to everyone. For those of you that are joining through the live stream, either on Zoom or YouTube, I apologize for the delay. But religious school is back in session, and that means I have to make the drive from there to home to do the casting, and the traffic is not always agreeable. I may want to discuss with my more frequent students that participate in the class of bumping back our start time to an official 7:15 just to avoid these types of days, because it does feel like the traffic is getting worse. But we can talk about that offline. Let's make the most of the time we've got for tonight. And that means picking up in chapter 4 of Mishnah Niddah. Now, as Dr. Culp points out in his introduction, chapter 4 is going to begin 1, 2, 3 with 3 different types of women. That is to say, 3 different types of women who are on the radar for the Jewish community and for whom we have questions about their status with regards to Niddah. And that is going to be Samaritans, the Sadducees, and the Gentiles or non-Jews. Now, you might be thinking, but Samaritans, they're not officially Jewish, are they? And well, it's complicated. The Kutim, as they are called in the text, are not officially Jewish in the sense that they are given full treatment as Jews under Jewish law, but because of their historical status, they are considered Jewish adjacent. And that means that there are different rules in certain circumstances for dealing with them than there would be for non-Jews completely. The Samaritans, according to the Hachamim, according to the sages who wrote the Mishnah, were a group of people that were brought in by the Assyrian Empire during the conquest and who adopted the local practices of the Jewish community, because that's what people did 2,500-ish, 2,700 years ago. You got relocated to a new land because that's what empires did. And when you got there, you would worship the gods of that land. So when these people who were being transplanted from other parts of the Assyrian Empire came to Israel and Judah, the 2 kingdoms of the time, they adopted the practices of Judaism, but they adopted them imperfectly. They did not officially convert. They definitely intermarried, however, with Jews who were not taken during that diaspora. And that became a very confused, blended community that developed their own interpretation and their own application of Torah and Jewish law. There are still some Kutim, some Samaritans around, very, very few, and they indeed have a very different set of behaviors. But some of it is very similar, as we'll see. The Sadducees, I will introduce as we get to the section on them, and then, of course, non-Jews for Mishnah number 3. So now that we got Samaritans as a clear idea, let's see how the law applies to them. The daughters of Samaritans are regarded as menstruants from their cradles. All right, so what in the world are we talking about here? Do we think that Samaritans begin to menstruate while still in the cradle? Of course not. What this is saying is that because of their different observation of Jewish law, they are considered to have become in contact with Niddah, and for women to have begun experiencing some of the issues of Niddah that have not been handled correctly by Jewish law at that point. As such, they are going to be considered as Niddah from the time they are basically born through the rest of their life until they actually adopt Jewish practices. So this is not saying that they are menstruating that early, but it is saying we have to assume that it might have happened and that it has not been dealt with properly. And because it hasn't been dealt with properly, they are going to just treat them all as though they were Niddah with regards to their impact on Jewish law, which we'll get to later on in the later chapters of Niddah, but they will have that status basically from birth. Again, this doesn't mean that they actually are menstruating from that early on. It just means that because of the different interpretations, the rabbis say we just have to treat them by default, unless we have information to the contrary, as though they are Niddah from the start. Now, what does that mean as a knock-on effect? And Samaritans impart uncleanness to a couch underneath as to a cover above, since they have intercourse with menstruants, because their wives sit unclean for 7 days on account of any blood. All right, this is going to get a little complicated. The first part is pretty straightforward, though, which means that the male Samaritans are also considered to have come into contact with a woman that was Niddah, because even though they behave according to their own idea of how the Torah wants us to be separate during that time, it comes with other problems, and it doesn't work out according to actual Jewish law. So that means we have to assume that the men have been with women that according to Jewish law would still be ritually impure because of Niddah, that the men now are also ritually impure as well, and they are passing on that transmission of uncleanness. Now, why does it say, though, that this is happening because their wives sit for unclean 7 days on account of any blood? Isn't that good, right? Isn't that being strict and stringent? I mean, after all, if you're going to sit as Niddah for 7 days on account of any blood, then you're covering all your bases, right? Wrong. All the way back to our first day. When the Torah talks about the separation of Niddah, it is different than the separation for a Zav or Zava. There are the regular menstrual cycle, and then there are the sighting of blood outside of the menstrual time. During the regular time when it is sighted, a person will say, all right, it has begun. I will now count 7 days. But those 7 days could still have additional sightings of bleeding. That doesn't matter, says the Torah. As long as it's done by day 7, then mikvah and you are clean. So what happens, according to the rabbis in the Samaritan world, is a woman will spot some kind of blood and will automatically assume that this is something that requires 7 days of separation. Now, that in of itself is not the catastrophe. The problem is that during those 7 days, she may have a different type of bleeding that is actual Niddah, and yet she is already in the midst of her first 7 days of counting, and thus she doesn't reset the counting to account for that later showing of blood during the original 7, which means she should have additional days at the end of the first 7 she began that she is not staying in Niddah. Thus, she will return to intercourse with her husband, and that means that he is now also rendered impure. And since that is a very easy problem to occur, we are going to make an assumption that a Samaritan man should also be considered to be having come into contact with Niddah as an assumption. Aaron, you got your hand up?
Yes, Rabbi. I just want to clarify the difference between Niddah and Zav. It's my understanding that Niddah is comes from the menstrual blood that happens during your period, right?
Correct.
And Zav is an unusual discharge, and it's either 3 days of blood or 3 days worth of blood, right?
Basically, yes. Or there are some other types of discharges as well, but that's the primary one. But the main difference is that if it is Niddah, meaning that it's the sighting of the blood during the regular time when it's expected to happen, then we have the 7 days as our basic measure. If it is a Zav or Zava for a woman, then that means we have the days of blood as being ritually impure. And then you have to count 7 clean days after that, on top of however many days there was the blood. So a Zava will usually end up being ritually impure for a longer period of time. But importantly for this particular Mishnah, it means that you have to actually have only clean days before you can actually say that it is gone. Whereas with Niddah, according to the Torah, not according to later rabbinic law, which we'll eventually summarize at the end of this course, but according to the Torah, you can have 7 days even with blood. So that's where knowing the difference between different types of blood becomes critical for preventing this issue, because we don't want somebody to begin counting for Niddah if it's not actually Niddah. And we do want somebody to have clean days if we are trying to deal with the Zava. And the Samaritans don't get that right, according to the rabbis. As such, we have to assume that they are having intercourse while, according to Jewish law, they are in states of ritual impurity.
You have to have a cycle of having a period before you can start counting for Niddah, right?
You have to have some level of predictability. It's not, this gets into how it eventually changes into the current system, which treats pretty much everybody as though there was a Zava each month, but that's a whole nother conversation for later. But yes, with Niddah, as far as the Torah and the basic Mishnah are concerned, you have to have a basic, what's called veset, a cycle that is relatively predictable. It doesn't have to be like down to the minute, but there need to be some signs that are frequent to you of what you would expect your menstruation to begin with.
And sorry, one final question. What was the 11-day rule again? Keep going.
So the 11 days that you're talking about is the period after the Niddah and before the next cycle. So that's another issue, which I believe we might get to tonight. We'll see how far we get. But there's an issue of discharges during that period are presumed to be a Zava condition rather than a Niddah condition, because they are during that window where Niddah is not expected.
All right.
Right. The basic ovulation cycle, once the menstruation has occurred, then ovulation begins. And if you get the bleeding during that ovulation window, then that is unusual by definition. As such, it's not considered Niddah. It's considered to be the Zava type problem.
Yeah, I just had trouble counting where the 11 days came from. I know it keeps coming up, but I couldn't count it right for some reason.
It's basically the ovulation window. And I'm just going to scroll through Dr. Kolb's explanation, which is basically what I went over. The latter part here of Dr. Kolb's text is a little more anthropology than halacha, but it is worth noting. The Kutim were considered to be a challenging community. I'll be as diplomatic as possible. The rabbis were not. Because the Kutim considered themselves to be perfectly legitimate as Jews, even though they just adopted it on their own rather than being formally brought into the community because of the way the Assyrians handled things. The rabbis were often in competition, especially during periods of occupation. So during the Roman time, the Samaritans would often try to curry favor with the Romans by basically attacking the mainstream Jewish communities. And this created a great deal of resentment, as you can imagine, between the Samaritan and the rabbinic and mainstream Jewish communities. So as Dr. Kolp is pointing out, some of the teachings regarding Samaritans are probably intended to maintain a social barrier between the mainstream Jews and the Samaritans because of the difficulties that were happening socially and politically between the two groups. But they also recognize the rabbis in halakha. However, on account of their uncleanness, no obligation is incurred from entrance into the temple, nor is truma burned on their account, since their uncleanness is only of doubtful nature. So, if a Samaritan, the Kuti, comes into contact with truma, or they come into the temple precincts, we do not have to be alarmed and assume that a transgression has occurred. We don't have to destroy the truma, believing it to have been defiled by ritual impurity. Instead, since we don't know whether they are actually ritually impure, we cannot create an actual punishment for that ritual impurity. We can still treat things that they come into contact with as ritually impure, but we do not treat it as though it is an obligation. So this is where presumption does not override other halakha. And that's a very important principle, that sometimes we have certain presumptions made in Jewish law, but that does not mean that it has the authority to override other actual halakha. All right, 4.2. Let's move on to the Sadducean. So these are the Sadduceans, and the Sadduceans were a different faction during the Second Temple period. The Sadducees were seen as being the primary rival within mainstream Judaism to the Pharisees, which was that the rabbis would eventually see as being their allies-ish in the past. It's a whole nother long conversation that I know Aaron and I love debating. So the Sadducees were a primary faction that basically died out with the destruction of the Second Temple, who believed in a more literal interpretation of the Torah, and who did not hold with the idea of the oral law, and they often were in positions of authority or power within the upper echelons of Jewish society. So the Sadducees had their own interpretation then of Torah, and it was wildly at variance with what the rabbis were trying to teach as being the actual continuation of the oral tradition. Yes, sir.
Hey, sorry to say this to you, but I noticed the footnote said that the Pharisees were the group that the rabbis considered themselves to be the descendants of. Is that universally accepted, or that's kind of unique to Dr. Not unique, but that's a lot of argument about that.
There's a lot of argument about that. The rabbis, as you and I have talked about, but I'll share with other people as well, definitely took issue with the Pharisees. There are many sections in the Talmud where they are very critical of the Pharisaic mentality. And the rabbis tended to treat it less as a political group and more as a style of behavior. But it was a style of behavior within a oral law, Torah Sheba'al Peh, rabbinic style of Judaism. So the Pharisees were a particular type of Jew who believed in the oral law, and thus they are co-believers with the rabbis, but it was not a flattering term in many of the places that it occurs in rabbinic Judaism when they talk about Pharisees. So descendant of, co-believer in the oral law, it's a lot of debate over whether or not the rabbis were from the Pharisees or whether they were parallel to the Pharisees, or whether the rabbis drew from the Pharisees and other groups as well. There's a lot of debate about exactly what happened with the destruction of the Second Temple and the great shakeup of the factionalism of that time. And since we basically only have the rabbinic view of what that time period looked like, apart from the Christian Bible, which has its own agenda, we are left kind of scratching our heads, saying, well, this is what the rabbis are saying, or at least suggesting about the time period. And Josephus said a few other things, but we're going to have to sort of go with our best guess of what that actually looked like. Unless, of course, you're a professor, in which case you can make more than a best guess, but you're still going to fight a lot of other professors who have a very different opinion on the topic. So that's really the best I can do. It's almost, in my opinion, from what I've read and what I have found convincing to me, until I learned something from a different person, because this is still very fluid, is I would prefer to think of the Pharisees as being less a political group and being more of a ideological label. Almost like, if you want to use the modern political terminology of America, a Pharisee would be somebody that might be a liberal or conservative. That's not a party affiliation. It is an ideological leaning. And they might still vote for a different political party. They might still do things that are objectionable to people who share their ideological title, because they're not a strict party. They're more of a loose confederation of people who share some beliefs around certain topics. So that's how I generally see the word Pharisee, as being a certain mindset rather than a particular tight faction. Whereas the Sadducees, we definitely know, were a much tighter faction, and the Dead Sea group we know was a tighter faction, and the Essenes that Josephus mentions were also a very tight faction. The Pharisees kind of seem like a splinter group of everybody else in their ideology towards how they did worship, which was very showy, very prominent, very attention-grabbing, very self-serving, which was what the rabbis objected to in their behavior. Okay, so with that in mind, the Sadducees were this other group that disagreed with the whole idea of an oral law. They were much more literal-minded. So what happens when we put them in the mix? The daughters of the Sadducees, so long as they are accustomed to walking in the paths of their fathers, are to be regarded as Samaritan women. If they left those paths to walk in the paths of Israel, they are to be regarded as Israelite women. All right, the sages are fairly balanced on this. They say, look, a girl that's raised in the Sadducean way, she's definitely Jewish, because the Sadducees are mainstream Jews. We disagree with their opinions, but they're definitely mainstream Jews. But if she is doing whatever her family taught her regarding Niddah, then we have to agree that they are going to be making the same kind of mistakes that the Samaritans would make. And that means we have to treat them as though they are in a state of Niddah, because that's the way they were raised. However, if a Sadducean woman has decided to adopt the paths of Israel, which is the beautiful phrase for halakha, if they have decided to go to the oral tradition and actually follow the way that Jews have passed down the means of following this rather than the literalism of the Sadducees, then presto chango, they are automatically into the category as any other Jewish woman, and they would be treated as, well, as we'll see later, by default according to whatever time of month they're in. So it is very easy for a Sadducean woman to simply say, my family was wrong, I am going to follow the oral law, and she is now in keeping with that, and we make the assumptions about her that we would about any other Israelite woman. So does that make sense? She is a Sadducee until she says otherwise, but when she says otherwise, then she's like any other Jewish woman. All right, let's just get this down here. Rabbi Yossi has a more lenient view. They are always regarded as Israelite women unless they leave the paths of Israel to walk in the paths of their fathers. So Rabbi Yossi is saying, well, you know, plenty of Sadducean women follow the oral Torah. Indeed, we know that the rabbis were very popular among women in the ancient world, meaning that many women found the oral law much more inviting both because it protected women's rights more than the literalism of some of the Sadducee or Samaritan interpretations. But even more importantly, the oral law allowed for a greater expression of female spirituality, and as such, it was not uncommon for women to want to be a part of the oral law tradition, even if the men in their life were rejecting that. And we also know, for example, that many of the people who were converting in the ancient world were often women for much the same reason, that they were leaving behind some of the restrictions of the pagan world and finding greater freedom and greater spirituality in Judaism. So Rabbi Yossi is saying, okay, look, we should assume that if she's Jewish, even if she came from a Sadducee family, that she is keeping Judaism. Of course, if she leaves the ways of Israel, if we know that she is a proud Sadducean, that she is definitely following the ways of that household practice, then of course we treat her as a Samaritan, and she has that same status. Now, Rabbi Yossi loses this argument, as is usually the case for a singular opinion, and instead it is the first opinion that was made normative, that she had to make a step into normative Jewish practice away from the Sadducean way, and then she would be given that presumption. Yes, sir.
How does Rabbi Yossi lose? Because by the time of the compilation of the Mishnah, the Sadduceans are basically gone. They're not really there. And
Correct.
By the time of the Talmud, they're clearly not there.
Absolutely. I mean, well, so first of all, we can't exactly say by the time of the Mishnah, because the collapse of the Sadducean way of life was not instant with the destruction of the Second Temple. It wasn't as though the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans and then all the Sadduceans just fell over. Many of the Sadduceans also tried to linger on, and they tried to, stagger forward with their greatly hampered Judaism, because without the temple, much of what the Sadduceans were doing was simply impossible and non-transferable in their mind. They were sort of trapped in that ideology. So, yeah, we definitely know that the Sadduceans collapsed, but it wasn't instant. So it would have taken a generation, 2, 3, maybe in different communities before the Sadducean ideology finally disappeared. So that can clearly happen. But on top of that, we also know that the rabbis wanted to handle topics even that were no longer being done. So, for example, the Mishnah talks extensively about exactly how the Torah, the temple sacrifices were carried out, even though the people who were compiling the Mishnah and around the 3rd century of the Common Era didn't even have a grandfather that would have seen the sacrifices in Jerusalem. But the oral law is the oral law. It is transmitted, so they still wanted to study and continue the teachings about the situation that existed prior to the destruction. So that's considered to be very important and very worthwhile, and of course can be important for precedent if similar topics come up. And indeed, with the Karaite schism that will happen later on, and then indeed into the modern world in the minds of some, we can use some of these teachings, or at least discuss whether they should be used with regard to how we interact with other Jewish communities. Thankfully, not everybody puts this out there in such strong language, but indeed some people will refer to these types of things.
So in the Talmud, when the Sadducees are basically no longer around, does it still say that Rabbi Yossi loses and they're still considered to be Sadduceans if they're theoretically from that descent? Or
well, it's not about descent, it's about what are they actually practicing. If anybody's still calling themselves a Sadducean household in the year 500, 600, 700, then yeah, that the halakha is still very relevant. The fact that almost nobody probably would have been is more likely. But
right.
But the rabbis still need to resolve the issue. They still need to make sure that we know what the halakha is. And, people will still be talking about this in commentary, or us, now 2,000 years later. And that's still considered a valid and germane discussion.
Right. But Rabbi Yossi says that there's a presumption that they are no longer Sadduceans, and that makes sense considered the Sadduceans would be so few.
That's true, but the question is not so much whether they have weakened their position, although that seems to be his argument, but it's more a question of, did they actually change? Because after all, the keeping of Niddah is something that could have been maintained even without the temple, unlike much else that they did. So Rabbi Yossi is saying, they're probably not doing it the other way. They're probably doing it like us, but the rest of the rabbis are not convinced. You need to go by what their actual official position is.
It was this still the position in the Talmud? Because I didn't look it up.
Yes, I mean this is halakha, that if you are a Sadducean, the presumption is that you are not keeping the halakha correctly. All right, and number 3 of our trilogy of women that we need to clear up, and of course we are going to make it more complicated. The blood of a Gentile and the clean blood of a Mitzorat. Okay, let's do that right there. Right, so the blood of a Gentile, right? So we are talking here, of course, about the issue of Niddah, or maybe Ziva, the issue of the non-Niddah blood of a different time, and the clean blood of a Mitzorat. Mitzorat is the woman that is suffering from Tzara'at. Tzara'at is the skin affliction, usually but wrongly translated as leprosy, that appears in the skin. So that is also a type of ritual impurity. So we're dealing with a parallel here between the blood of a Gentile and the blood of a Tzara'at. Now, what is the clean blood of a Mitzorat? Well, that is the blood that is shown during the post-childbirth window. We've talked about this now a few times, but just for quick remembrance, if you give birth to a boy, you get 7 days where all of the blood is considered to be ritually impure, and then you get 33 days where any blood is considered to be ritually pure or clean blood. That is the time period we're talking about, and double those numbers if it was a girl that was born. So in the case of that 33-day, double for a girl, postnatal bleeding, or if you are dealing with just a regular non-Jewish woman, Beit Shammai declares the blood in both of those cases to be clean. And Beit Hillel holds that it is like her spittle or her urine. Okay, so what are we arguing about here? So what we're arguing about here is that, does the topic of Niddah actually even apply to a non-Jewish woman? Because after all, as Dr. Culp points out, Leviticus 15, this is addressed to Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel. So it would seem like the issue of Niddah doesn't apply to a non-Jewish woman at all. And indeed, in many issues, we don't apply Jewish law as being relevant in a non-Jewish setting, because halakha has jurisdiction only over Jewish people, apart from a few notable exceptions, usually what we call the Noahide laws. So what should the status be? Now, Beit Shammai declares them to be clean. Look, it doesn't apply, it doesn't apply. And likewise, the Mitzorat, if the Torah says that during that 33 window, any blood symbols are clean, then even though you are a Mitzorat, even though you have this skin affliction which creates impurity, the blood should not be under that same category because it's clean, right? That's what Parashat Tazria tells us. Beit Hillel, on the other hand, disagrees, right? Beit Hillel argues, and we'll just roll it down so you can see down here, that we have a special stringency with regards to the spit or the urine of both non-Jewish as well as a Mitzorat, that we treat them as being potential sources of ritual impurity. And Beit Hillel says, even though the Torah doesn't demand that their blood be in that category, we should nonetheless declare it. We should still hold that is ritually impure. Now, this is different, as Dr. Kolb points out. It is de Rabbanan rather than deoraita, that it is not the Torah that is making these two things ritually impure, but it is a rabbinic enactment making them ritually impure. And he says, but basically we need to be consistent. If we've made a rabbinic enactment to render the spit and the urine ritually impure, then consistency tells me that the blood needs to also be considered ritually impure. Makes sense? Let me just scroll down. As you can see, Dr. Kolb had to take quite a while to explain all of that. Hopefully my explanation was as good, but I don't consider myself as elegant in writing, but then I hope I'm a little quicker. Okay. Part 2. The blood of a woman after childbirth, English. The blood of a woman after childbirth who did not immerse in a mikvah, right? So she's gone through the period of childbirth. She is then in her 7 or 14-day period, and she is supposed to go to a mikvah. And then after that, of course, we have that period of clean blood. If she doesn't go to the mikvah at the end of 7 or 14 days, depending upon boy or girl, what's the ruling? Beit Shammai says it is like her spittle and urine, right? Beit Shammai says, no, we just treat this like spittle or urine, and spittle and urine would only defile when it is wet, and her blood is going to have that same status, that if it is dry blood, it doesn't contaminate. If it is still moist, then it will. That is the compromise ruling, if you will, based upon her non going to the mikvah. But Beit Hillel says it conveys uncleanness both when wet and when dry. That nope, we are going to treat this as though it were impure, regardless of the moisture level, and that is going to be the default stringency. Now, they do agree, however, they don't only argue. They agree that if she gives birth while in ziva, it conveys uncleanness both when wet and with dry. Okay, so let's back it up, and we're going to figure out how this might work in just a bit. Let's imagine a woman is pregnant, and she is in her final month, and she begins to have a bleeding discharge that is determined to be ziva, that puts her as a zava, right? So now we're in the irregular discharge mode. And then while she is still in that period, meaning she has not stopped showing blood or has not counted enough clean days to go to the mikvah, during that period, while she is still ritually impure, she gives birth. Okay, if she gives birth during that period, then she is now going to still need to go to the mikvah to have ritual purification, not from the birth process, but from the ziva, right? From being a zava prior to this, she still needs to go to the mikvah to take care of that ritual impurity. As such, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai both agree that until she goes to the mikvah, that the blood is going to convey ritual impurity, whether wet or dry, because it is treated still as ziva blood, not as the post-birth blood. Yes, sir.
Hey, not to jump ahead, but the very next line of 4:4 of those says, if she's having difficulty in labor, it's regarded as menstruant blood. So wouldn't the 7 days just kick in and she can?
So difficulty in labor is different, right? So difficulty in labor is not the only way that blood can be released. And in fact, what we're talking about here in chapter 4, in Mishnah 4 of chapter 4, is a hard labor, not necessarily bleeding. Now, there can be bleeding, and that's what we're going to talk about here, but we're talking about like contractions that are already happening. Whereas in 4:3, what we were talking about would be a discharge of blood that didn't come with signs of labor. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just thought by the time you get to the labor, the blood would be considered menstrual blood. And not that I know
Okay,
anything about
so
giving birth,
we
but it
need,
seems like, I was gonna say, it
I'm
seems
sorry,
like
I think.
difficult labors are a redundant statement. All labor.
Okay, so all labor is hard. That's why it's called labor. Absolutely. Not trying to take away from that at all. But as we're going to see in the discussion in Mishnah 4, some labors are harder than others. And the rabbis had, well, we're going to see an argument about the benchmark for what counts as difficult labor with regards to this topic. Again, like so many topics that we come across in the Mishnah, we're dealing with a technical definition. We're not dealing with a generic adjective like difficult. So let's see what their definitions are going to be. So we'll pick up here in the first part of Mishnah 4 of chapter 4. A woman who is having difficult labor is regarded as a menstruant. Okay, now, obviously, she's not an actual menstruant. She's not actually Niddah, because you can't be going through the process of ovulation and followed by menstruation when you've got a baby inside you, right? That basic biology, and the rabbis knew that, right? This is not an error in their science. They absolutely knew that. What they are dealing with here is a technical term, and they are saying that if there is a sign of blood while a difficult labor is proceeding, then we will treat it like menstruation with regards to how long it is watched, what purification process is needed, and what impact that ritual contamination has on the world around her. And as Dr. Kolb points out, this is definitely a leniency, right? Because being a zava rather than niddah would have different stringencies attached to it. So this is going to be given a technical definition as menstrual blood, even though it is definitely not actual menstruation. Now, just as a little bit behind this topic, this is one of those places where we can see that the rabbis did not consider their job to be just looking through a microscope to analyze the situation. They also recognize that the word menstruation is very limited in the modern English, but that the term niddah in Hebrew can cover a broader range of situations. So even though this is not microscope level menstruation, it still falls under the Hebrew category of niddah. So that's an important thing to keep reminding ourselves in many of these issues when we're talking about categories, and that'll be really true when we get into chapter 5, that they are not talking about laboratory testing. They are talking about legal terminology. And that is something that the rabbis consider very important to remember. I just wish they would remind modern readers of that more. Okay, so let's talk about what this difficulty means. If she had difficult labor for 3 days of the 11 days, and she ceased having pains for 24 hours and then gave birth, she is regarded as having given birth in Ziva, the words of Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Joshua says, a night and a day as the night and day of Shabbat. All right, so here's our 11 days that I believe that, Aaron, you brought up earlier. Let me just see if I can get that there, all on one screen. The 11 days here are the 11 days in between the menstrual cycle, in between niddah, where any blood flow is automatically considered to be putting her in a state of ziva, right? If she has blood during that 11 days following the beginning of ovulation, then it is definitely irregular. It's not just an early next cycle or a late, previous cycle. It is definitely irregular. And that means that this is, you do not pass go. It is straight as being ziva, and she is now a zava. Okay, so if during that 11-day window, when her cycle would normally be happening, and when she would not be in niddah, but definitely be in the ziva window, the 11 days, she goes into contractions. She is laboring, and for 3 days. Now, I know 3 days sounds like a lot, but this is the ancient world. They've got techniques and they've got their own remedies for dealing with hard labor. But remember, they do not have a sonogram. They do not have ultrasound. They do not have different ways of inducing labor or dilation or any of that. So yeah, labor could go on for multiple days, and women could die of exhaustion from birth. And although we will talk about cesareans eventually, it was a very dicey proposition to do a cesarean. So that's the situation we're in. It may sound clinical and it may sound callous, but the rabbis need to get the halacha right on this topic, and of course, comfort and provide support for the actual human being going through it. So 3 days, hard labor, contractions, pains, all the signs of labor, but then it stops. And then she gives birth, right? So she has 3 days of labor, and then the labor goes away for a day, and then she goes back into labor and she gives birth. What do we categorize the blood flow that she has at that point? Well, we have to consider that to be a state of ziva. She is during the 11 days, and she is having this issue with a 24-hour period that it's not labor, right? That she's not actually going through contractions. Because of that window, she is now considered to be a ziva rather than a niddah, rather than menstruate. And then Rabbi Joshua was just arguing about the terminology that a night and a day, we need to treat this the same way as we would a Shabbat, that there has to be this whole day cycle that is more generous, a longer period of time than just 24 hours, that it's a bigger cushion before we put her into the official ziva category rather than niddah category. Okay, and then part 3, that she ceased from having pain, but not from bleeding, right? This, we have to understand what we mean by she ceased. Well, I sort of already mentioned this, that the labor went away, the contractions went away, but there was still bleeding. But because that bleeding was during the 11-day window, and because she was more than a day away from the actual labor, meaning the contractions and pain, we have to consider the bleeding that happened during that window to be the ziva blood rather than the niddah blood. Probably more about labor than you were expecting, but hey, we're not done yet. Mishnah number 5. How long can protracted labor be considered as lasting? Right? We've been talking about this difficult labor, and we mentioned 3 days, but how long can this go on and have us still call it labor? I mean, like, just because she's having pain, does that count? I mean, is that labor and that we're going to consider this niddah? Or is it not labor and we have to consider the blood flow as being a ziva? Okay, what do we do? Rabbi Meir says, even 40 or 50 days, all right, which is basically saying, look, if she goes into labor 2 months before the actual due date, and she is having pain, and there is blood, we consider that blood to be niddah. It doesn't matter that this is 2 months out. It doesn't matter that she labors for 2 months. I mean, it matters obviously for her, but it doesn't matter for our definition of this is labor as opposed to another form of irregular bleeding. If the pain is there, it's labor. Rabbi Yehuda says the 9th month suffices for her. Look, you don't go into labor 2 months early. That's not the beginnings of birth. You can't call that labor. But within the last month, well, yeah, I can imagine, says Rabbi Judah, that some women begin labor a month out, and it may not be fast, but it's still one long process leading up to the actual birth. And any blood seen during that time would be considered niddah, says Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yossi says, oh, sorry, Aaron, yes?
Back to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, at this time, there was a belief that you could only go into labor in the 9th or 7th month, right?
Yes. So it's a little confusing exactly why the rabbis made some of the rulings they had about birth on that particular point. where they believe that a baby born in the 8th month would be considered non-viable, whereas a baby born in the 7th month and 9th month obviously would be considered viable. Their underlying reasoning for that is not exactly clear, and it is definitely not medicinally or anatomically correct. A baby born in the 8th month will have a much better chance of survival than a baby born in the 7th, and the baby in the 9th obviously is going to have the best chance of all. I believe that I have heard from some other teachers that this was another one of those foreign medical ideas that were brought in, that, you know, the Greeks and others around them had similar notions that certain organs were developing in different ways, and thus earlier was slightly better because then it would go through a shift during month 8 and then be like fixed in month 9. But I've never seen conclusive evidence of that. That's only something that I heard orally from a colleague. So it's unclear why they had that a particular opinion. But yes, month number 8 was considered a very bad month to give birth in. That was more dangerous to the child than month 7 or and of course 9.
How come it's just the 9th month then? How come it can't be the 7th?
Well, because for it to be the 7th, it would have to continue through the 8th, and the 8th is not the right time according to the rabbis. So by default, they would assume that that's not actually labor.
I thought it could be in the 7th.
No, but if it began in the 7th, I'm seeing, why didn't Rabbi Yehuda say that?
Yeah.
Well, I think because the idea was that the 9th was the real labor that we could actually determine. Because remember, you have to begin to say whether or not the blood is Niddah or Ziva immediately. You don't get to say that like after 40 days and then the baby comes and you say, oh, this really was labor. You have to make a determination because of the ritual purity issues, at the beginning of the pain, not at the end when you know how long it was before the baby came.
So Rabbi Meir's thing is kind of interesting because this says 40 or 50 days, which would put you in the 8th month.
Or even further, as Dr. Colt points out, it seems like what Rabbi Meir is saying, anytime from when it's even possible, we would consider this to be Niddah, because it could very well be labor.
I thought the 8th month wasn't possible, though.
And that's why Rabbi Meir's opinion is the outlier. And of course, excuse me again, he loses that particular argument, and so does Rabbi Yehuda. Let's meet today's winner. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say protracted labor is not for more than 2 weeks before birth. Right? If you're going into labor in month 8 or 7, or even the beginning of month 9, that's pain, it's uncomfortable, and we will try to make you as comfortable as possible. But as far as the determination whether the blood is Niddah or Ziva, it's going to be considered Ziva unless this is only 2 weeks out from the due date. We're not going to entertain the notion that labor is really labor more further out. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound very fair. How do the rabbis get to decide how long labor can be? Who are they to determine blah, blah? They're the ones who made the leniency in the first place, right? According to a very narrow reading, you would probably be inclined to say anything that wasn't involved in the actual immediate birth act would be considered Ziva rather than Niddah. The rabbis are the ones who at the beginning of this section of chapter 4 said, we're going to treat labor pain blood as being Niddah, not Ziva. They already created this leniency, and they are thus in a position to put a limit on the leniency they have created. Right? They are not interpreting the rules around it. They are interpreting from what they believe to be the correct window to apply this particular leniency. So that's where they get the right to dicker over this particular problem. All right, and we are really running out of time. You know what? We're going to go ahead because this is a long one. Yeah, we're going to go ahead and leave 4-6 for next week. Since I've got both of you on for the last couple minutes here, I want to just take a moment. We just resumed our Wednesday religious school, and it was great being back with our kids. but it's not so great being back with the traffic. The traffic seems to be getting worse and worse in this portion of the Orlando area. So I am suggesting, but I'm willing to listen to the opinions of those of you who join in live, to move our class to 7:15 as the default start time. Because if we keep it at 7, there's a real possibility I'll be late, or we'll have to push it to 7:15 anyway. If we push it to 7:15, then we can do 7:15 to 8:15 and keep it like that. But if you have other things at 8 that are important to your schedules, let me know. But I'm seeing 2 thumbs up. Okay, so I'll make sure the office knows. We'll get it in the publicity, but 7:15 for next week, and then you don't have to look out for a panicked, I'm sitting at a traffic light, I'm going to be late, sort of message. So 7:15 going forward will be our new start time. Thank you for your flexibility. And here's hoping the traffic lightens up.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yes.